Okay, so this is a brief overview, and I mean very brief overview of African American history from Reconstruction on to about the civil rights movement, a little bit beyond that. I had a friend ask me just to do a quick kind of overview of that, and so this could be helpful for a number of reasons. If you're an adult and it's been a long time since you've taken a U.S. history class, also, we need to kind of understand, particularly if you grew up in the South, there was like a really concerted effort to rewrite history, particularly surrounding African Americans, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, depending on your history teacher, they may have just been boring, or they may have intentionally or even unintentionally, depending on how they were taught, looked at some different events. So, anyways, this is a semester-long course. So I'm going to try to make it as short as I can, but know that that means it's going to be super oversimplified. So I'm going to try to point to a lot of things to read or watch if you want to go more in depth. But anyways, I taught African American history for 6 years at Garner Magnet High School, and then I've taught U.S. history for 8 years total. At the high school, basically 12th grade and 8th grade level. So, like I said, I know what the history books say, and a lot of them are lacking, and there are very specific reasons why. Not all of them, but some of them. So, anyways, here we go. We're going to start with Reconstruction. So the first thing to kind of start with is understanding that today, people are very divided about how we should move forward, how we need to deal with slavery, like in 2020, and it's always been like that. So, like since day one. So, first off, Reconstruction is the period of time that is after the Civil War ends. So, 1865, it lasts about 12 years. So, with that, I want you to kind of look at it a couple of different ways. So it's the occupation of the South, like the military occupation of the South. But usually what people are talking about is they're talking about the reunification of the former Confederacy, so the South, and putting them back into the Union, okay? So a lot of times we think of the Union as the North, but really, like, it's the nation as a whole. So there's three main plans, and anyways, I'll just start with him. So Lincoln's plan was first. He was president at the time. You need to understand about Lincoln, so particularly like the Lincoln movie that came out like 10 years ago. It's just a romantic view of Lincoln. I don't think it's very historically accurate in a lot of cases. It kind of portrays Lincoln as this man who is just heartbroken over the injustices of slavery. And Lincoln, to a certain extent, personally did not like slavery, but that wasn't his primary focus. His primary focus was protecting the Union. When I say the Union, I don't mean like the North. I mean like the country as a whole. He wanted to bring the country back together. There's actually a quote, and I'm going to read it. It says, this is from Lincoln himself. He says, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it," meaning the Union, "by freeing some slaves and leaving others alone, I would also do that." And he goes on to say that he sees his view as a president, that is his primary goal. But personally, he doesn't agree with slavery. So it's just really important to understand that whenever you're thinking about Lincoln's Reconstruction plan. So his Reconstruction plan is kind of middle of the road. It is not super harsh on the South because he wants the South to come back into the fold. So he only required about 10% of Southerners to pledge an oath of loyalty. But then he did some things to like try to protect African Americans, but not at the expense of those white Southerners. Okay, so he's kind of in the middle. He dies like days after the war ends. And so his vice president, Andrew Johnson, has a very different Reconstruction plan. You have to understand, Andrew Johnson was a Southerner, and he didn't like slavery just because of economic reasons. But he is not a friend of the Black folk, okay, by any shadow of the imagination. So he kind of comes in and forgives all of these Confederates of all the things that they had done wrong, gives them their land back. So if you've ever heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule, that land where that came from was former Confederates that had been confiscated. So when he gives that land back, that means that those former slaves are not getting their 40 acres, and they certainly aren't getting their mule. So that's part of that. So Andrew Johnson has an arch nemesis in Congress, and it's the Republican Party. So Lincoln and Johnson are both Republicans, and I need you to understand this. Anything that you think you know about a modern day Republican or a modern day Democrat, you have to throw that out of your mind. To say they're opposite doesn't even make sense completely either. They're just completely different. So Lincoln was of the Republican Party. They were the ones at the time that was pushing for, if anybody was pushing against slavery, it was them, but they weren't really pushing against slavery. They were really trying to crush the South. So we're going back. Sorry, history teacher, can't help it. If we go back to the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, which is when all of the slaves in the Confederacy were given their freedom legally, but not in actuality. In actuality, it doesn't happen until Juneteenth, so go look that up if you want to research more on that. That was not done for a moral reason. Lincoln didn't just wake up one day and say, oh, slavery, real bad, can't sleep at night. No, he did it because he wanted to make the war end. And he felt like at that point, the only thing that he could do was hit the South where their heart was, which was their wallet. And so crush their economy so that they would surrender. And the way to do that was hurt slavery. So anyways, there's that. Okay, so like I said, Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, right in the middle. Andrew Johnson, so this is called the Johnson Plan. It was more towards like what white Southerners would have liked. And then you've got the radical Republicans. So you've got Lincoln go more radical. That was a group of the Republicans that were in Congress. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to punish the South. They wanted to crush the South into the dust because they had cost lives, they had cost lots of money, and they wanted to punish the South so that they would never try to rebel again. And so anyways, what you're going to end up getting is you're going to kind of go back and forth between the radical Republican plan and the Johnson plan, which one's kind of happening. So there's kind of that. So Johnson and the radical Republicans did not get along. Okay, so anyways, what's going on in the South? It's being occupied militarily. So the Union soldiers have come down and they are occupying the South, kind of making sure that the South frees their slaves and just kind of holding things down. 5 military districts. It's what's going on. That being said, this is not a fantastic time for African Americans. Okay, so on one side, some good things happen. So at this point, the 13th Amendment is going to be passed, which outlaws slavery completely. So that's a happy day. Yay, slavery's over. The problem is the moment that happens, slaves, now we're going to start calling them freedmen because they're not slaves anymore. So these are former slaves, freedmen. They're in a rough spot. They have no property. They are not citizens. They have no protection. They actually had more protection under slavery, which doesn't really make sense, but they were worth something financially to the slave owner. Now they have no monetary value, and so their lives are seen as expendable. So this is going to be the time period that the KKK rises up out of Tennessee. During this time period, we'll talk more about them. I don't want to get into them yet. So anyways, kind of where we're at is we are going to see in some states, African Americans, they shouldn't be called African Americans yet. We're not there yet. Sorry. Freedmen. So these are former slaves. They are going to have some representation. So actually Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, his Senate seat is going to be filled by a black man. Most of them are like local positions, which actually has quite a bit more power, but we're going to see some state positions as well. So that happens some. So that's a pretty good thing. But because of the KKK, there's going to be a ton of just attacks, random attacks on African Americans. Any property that they do have is going to be attacked. And so this is a really, really rough time for African Americans during this time period. And again, shouldn't really call them African Americans because they're not American citizens yet. Okay, so Freedmen's Bureau. So this is a federal organization that kind of comes down to the South, and it tries to, in theory, help African Americans or freedmen at this time period. It aims to do good in some cases, but it does a lot of damage in other cases. So the goal was to help these freedmen navigate contracts with former slave owners to set up sharecropping and tenant farming, basically to provide some employment for those freedmen. But what we're going to see is that a lot of the Freedmen Bureau are going to force freedmen into signing these contracts, and in some cases, if they didn't sign these contracts, they could actually be arrested and put in jail. And so a lot of these contracts are going to set up a system. So we move from slavery is the main thing in the economy to now sharecropping and tenant farming is going to be the main fuel for the economy, to where we're setting up generations of future African Americans for poverty and being stuck in kind of this serfdom of the South. And so it's a really terrible thing. And the Freedmen's Bureau also set up schools to help with literacy for former slaves, because remember, during slavery it was illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write. So it does some good things. It's supposed to provide some housing and some food. So it's supposed to provide some things, but the main thing is when Johnson has control, under him, he's basically going to defund it. So there's not enough money and there's not enough people to help the millions of freedmen that are in the South. And so it does some good, but in a lot of cases, especially with sharecropping, it's going to do a lot of damage. Okay, so let's talk Constitution. The Reconstruction Amendments are 13, 14, 15. So 13th Amendment, we've already mentioned, this is going to outlaw slavery. So the Emancipation outlaws slavery only in the Confederate States. So there were some border states that got to keep their slaves because they were a part of the Union. So the 13th Amendment completely gets rid of slavery, except for in the case of prisons. And we'll get back to that because that's an important exception. 14th Amendment. This is going to say who is and who is not a citizen. So basically it says if you were born in the United States, you are a citizen. And as a citizen, you have equal protection under the law. So now they are African Americans. So African Americans not only are now citizens, but it says that they should be protected. If I remember correctly, this does not include Native Americans. So they're not considered citizens yet. And they do not have equal protection under the law. Whole nother story. Won't get into that right now. So 15th Amendment, this is going to give Black men the right to vote. So women don't get the right to vote until 1919, 1918. I think there's some Western territories that give it a little bit earlier. But we're still a long way off from women getting the right to vote. Okay. So states are, specifically Southern states, are going to do their best to keep African Americans from voting. But during this little 12-year stint of Reconstruction, African Americans are more likely to get a chance to vote than they are in, say, the next till 1950. So this is a little time period where they're able to vote a little bit. Okay. Like I said, mentioned the KKK before. They spring up during Reconstruction, during this military occupation, and there's a lot of violence. There is a lot of lynching, which is any ritualized killing. This is going to exclude executions, so no trial. And so this is going to end around the end of Reconstruction, and we won't see them come back until the early 1900s. And they're going to come back. But basically, they don't need to do all this stuff secretly because Reconstruction ends, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so we're now up to about 1876. Okay, so we're right at the end of Reconstruction. It hasn't ended yet, but it's coming. Basically, there's going to be an economic crisis in the North, and Northern whites are getting tired of protecting African Americans. And basically, they're like, hey, economy sucks. I don't want to spend money on soldiers down south. So they kind of stopped. That's kind of, we're getting there. Not yet. Okay. So when I talked about history and it being rewritten, so the UDC, so this is the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they launch a program to rewrite history. The reasons why the Confederacy fought the war was 100% over slavery, okay? And I say that, and I know that some of y'all are like, no, it's states' rights. It was states' rights to own slaves, okay? And I say that the majority of white Southerners do not own slaves because they don't have the money to own slaves. Slaves were super, super expensive, but they wanted the possibility of it. Like, think of it today. It's like today, millionaires and billionaires getting these huge tax cuts and people being in favor of it because they're like, one day I might be a millionaire and I want those big tax cuts. It's not quite that simple, but it was states' rights, but it was the states' rights to own slavery. Like, if you look at the Constitution written by the Confederacy, it talks about slavery in like step one, okay? So that was an effort of the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, to rewrite history. And we're going to see them pop up again in the early 1900s with the Confederate statues, okay? So those Confederate statues are not put up after the war, like right after the war. They're not put up during Reconstruction. They're not even put up right after Reconstruction because the South lost. They committed treason against the North. So, like, saying like, hey, here's some heroes, like, they're still being occupied. That wouldn't happen. Okay, so now let's end Reconstruction. So what ends Reconstruction is a compromise of 1877. So the year before that, there's an election, 1876, and there isn't enough electoral votes. It's kind of a mess. So what it does is it goes to the House, and basically there's a closed door conversation where they say, all right, we will let the Republican candidate win, even though he didn't have the popular vote, and even though he didn't have the majority of the electoral votes. We'll let him win if you promise to remove those Union troops from the South and end all Reconstruction plan. And basically, but everybody agrees, and they're like, yep, sure, that's fine. So at this point, blacks are completely abandoned. And so Democratic governments are going to push out all African Americans that are serving in representation. And this is when you're going to see Jim Crow, segregation start to take over in the South. And these are all state laws. So every state is a little bit different if you go and you look into that. Okay. So during this time period, what you need to understand, so basically, end of Reconstruction, so that's like late 1870s, 1880s through 1968. This is a time period of lynching. So this is where I'm going to give you a resource. If you want to go and look more into lynching, there's these things called lynching postcards, and there's a historian that he has a website. It's super old, but it's called Without Sanctuary, and that is where he's collected a lot of these lynching postcards. There were almost 5,000 lynchings that took place during this time period. And again, I said lynchings, that does not include like state-sanctioned executions, which happened all the time. So that number of like unfair deaths and killings would be much higher. And you need to understand like the brutality of lynching. So people would like bring their families. They would bring a picnic lunch. Politicians would have stump speeches at these lynchings. And a lot of times the reason someone was lynched was because they had tried to vote, or they had been financially independent in some way. So there was one case, Samuel Hose, where he was lynched because he opened up a grocery store in a black community to serve the black community, and the white grocery store owners didn't like it because they took away from his business, and they lynched him. There's also tons of cases of women being lynched, like pregnant women being lynched, and their babies being ripped from their bodies. And people took pictures, they put them on postcards, they sent them all around the country. And like, think about that. Like, the post office is an agent of the federal government, and you just took a picture of a murder and you sent it without an envelope, like through the mail. And people did this. Like, I mean, it was absolutely insane. And it's happening like all over the country. So if you want to know a really like this is more information. A really super cool person to look into. Her name is Ida B. Wells. She was a rock star. She was a friend of Samuel Ho's, and she would go and she would collect information. All of this data, she would go in the South and collect all this data about lynching to try to take it and get some action. And whenever she took this to basically the forerunner of the NAACP, they were like, this is inappropriate. You're a woman. I don't know if that's what they sounded like, but essentially she is like a bad A, like doing some work. And I believe they ended up having a bounty on her head in the South, but she kept doing it. So anyway, she's super cool, interesting person to look into. Okay, so what I said about lynching, that was really important, is that is no trial. So now we have to look at the prison system. So I told you the 13th Amendment got rid of slavery with the exception of prisons. So you have to understand, whenever slavery goes away, it leaves this giant void in the South. So how is the new democratic South going to fix that? They create the prison system, and they pass laws, like for one was called a pig law. And basically, if you stole anything up to the cost of a pig, you could be put in jail for life. Or it was like a 20 or 30-year sentence, and they put you in prisons like Parchment Farm, where you would die before you finished serving your term. Think for a second, why would someone steal a pig? Why do you steal a pig? Not for a joyride, because you're hungry, because you're starving and you're trying to feed your family. So that is super important for us to understand, that there are thousands of men that are basically killed through that. Also, if any allegation came against an African-American man or a woman, specifically rape charges were a big one against men, which is hilarious in an ironic sort of way, because the vast majority, and I'm talking like almost all, of the rapes that were taking place interracially, it was white men raping black women. But who always got accused of raping a white woman? A black man. And it usually just wasn't the case. So anyways, I'll show you my books now. Get my books out. Okay, this is, I don't know if you can see it. It's called Worse Than Slavery, Parchment Farm, and the Ordeal of Jim Crow Justice. That is a fantastic book if you want to learn more about the prison system. It's called the penal, like it's just, oh gosh, it's crazy. Insane. Okay, anyways. Also during this time period, so remember, we said the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. Well, Southern states got to do something about that, because black men are not going to vote for these crazy segregation, Jim Crow, white politicians. So this is a bunch of state policies for disenfranchisement. So basically taking away the rights of black men to vote. So they did this in a number of different ways, and this was done at the state level. So they just used a couple different ones. So one was a grandfather clause. Actually, I'm going to skip that one. I'll come back to that one in a second. One was a poll tax. So you had to pay to be able to vote, unless they used the grandfather clause, unless your grandfather was registered to vote in the last election. Well, hey, guess what? Black men, what were your grandfathers? Slaves. They weren't citizens. They weren't allowed to vote. So what that does is it makes black men pay the poll tax, but it keeps poor whites from having to pay that tax. Okay, if that wasn't enough, they would do literacy tests. And sometimes people think it's like, oh, it wouldn't be a bad idea if people like had to know how to read to vote. That doesn't seem terrible. That's not what a literacy test was. Basically, if I was giving you a literacy test, you came in, you're white, I'm like, how do you spell your name? You spell your name? Okay, cool, you get to vote. If a black person walks in, I say, please recite for me the preamble to the North Carolina State Constitution. What is Section 3, Part 4, blah, 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 blah. Could you please interpret that? Nope, not good enough. You lose. So that's the way that those worked, okay? And that is going to continue on those ways of states. And I believe that was the way that states disenfranchised African-American voters all the way up into what we call like the modern day civil rights movement. Okay, so those tricks are going to be around for a good long time. Okay, so I mentioned segregation. So Jim Crow are state laws that segregate African Americans from whites. Okay, so if you want to look more into why it's called Jim Crow, they're called minstrel shows. And so this is where like blackface comes in. So if you're interested in that, I can talk to you about that. There's a lot of stereotypes that come from this. So like the Jezebel, the Black Mammy. So that's like what Aunt Jemima was. That's why they're getting rid of her. Jim Crow himself, Zip Coon, all of those are characters that were in a story where white actors would paint their faces black and do these exaggerated lips and play ridiculous characters of Black people. And a lot of that was happening in the South, or sorry, in the North. And this was how people thought of Black people. This was the only exposure that a lot of white folks had to Black people. And in their mind, this is what Black people were like. So this is kind of like the first, like almost like a media war assaulting the Black character. Okay. So anyways, the segregation laws were a law to protect gentle white folks from ridiculous character of Jim Crow. So in theory, like legally, these were supposed to be equal. And we'll talk about like where this legal bound comes in just a few minutes. It's the Homer Plessy case. But they were never equal. We'll get back to that in just a second. Okay, so that's going on. So while the segregation is happening, the Black community is turning within. They set up Black Wall Streets. They set up Black businesses that serve Black communities, Black churches, setting up Black schools. Basically, they are taking care of themselves and their community because the white community has been so vicious towards them. Okay. And this doesn't work like completely because a lot of particularly Black women worked as domestics. So they worked kind of as maids. And so that put them in the household of whites, which put them at a huge risk of being raped with no repercussion for their rapists. And then a lot of African Americans, specifically in the Delta, which is like the Mississippi area, they're working as sharecroppers or tenant farms. That's happening also in like Florida, North Carolina, basically the whole South. So to an extent, the Black community, as much as it can, has turned within. Okay, so while this is happening, we've got two major leaders that are going to emerge within the Black community. We've got Booker T. Washington, who was a former slave, and then the next generation, his mentee is W.E.B. Du Bois. So let's talk about Booker T. Washington first. So Booker T. Washington was a former slave. And so he gives this speech, it's called Cast on Your Bucket. He believes that if African Americans keep their head down, educate and better themselves, work really, really hard, and become financially independent, that the white community will say, hey, we've treated you terrible. Let's not treat you like crap anymore. And so he sets up the Tuskegee Institute, which is basically like a trade school. And so this is when you've got like George Washington Carver, the man who invented peanuts, but not he invented peanuts, sorry, peanut butter. He tries to help the South change from a reliance on cotton to a reliance on peanuts. Anyways, sorry, I get off track. So that's going on. As that's going on, another man comes up, W.E.B. Du Bois. Like I said, he's the next generation. Du Bois was never, and it's not Du Bois. It wasn't, just trust me. Du Bois. Du Bois was never a slave. So he has a different mentality than Booker T. Washington, okay? He's also the next generation. So usually the next generation is more progressive than the previous one. So he works under Booker T, but eventually starts to say like, hey, if this keeping our head down and working real hard was going to work, maybe it would have worked during the 400 years of slavery. And it didn't. Like nobody said like, oh, I feel bad. I've treated you poorly. Let me like give you some decency, some dignity that you deserve. No, that didn't happen. And so we start to see this divide between Du Bois and Booker T. And in the beginning, everyone is going to support Booker T. Washington. But then we're going to start to see these race riots. And I want you to be careful. Don't think of them in the way that the media portrays race riots today. What this was the white community attacking the Black community, usually over an economic situation. So particularly this happens in Atlanta. Before I get to Atlanta, let's go back. Wilmington race riots. Please look these up. Wilmington, North Carolina. So the Wilmington race riots and the election of 1898, 99, The News and Observer has a fantastic, it's like pretty long, it's like 15 pages, but they did a fantastic, Timothy B. Tyson, he wrote Blood Doesn't Sign My Name. He's a professor at Duke. Fantastic explanation of all of that. Basically, the Democrats overthrew a fusion government in North Carolina to completely disenfranchise Black voters and take over the state. And it started in Wilmington, North Carolina, which was where the strongest Black community originally was. It's crazy. Like, look into it. It's nuts. Again, News and Observer. You can find it online, PDF. So great. Like, explains it all. The reason I talk about that is because that is going to set a framework of here is how to completely get rid of a thriving Black community. A couple years later, that happens in Atlanta. Atlanta was the strongest Black economic community probably in the whole country at the time. And so if anywhere to test this theory of Booker T. Washington, keep your head down, and eventually things will get better. Better yourself first before you ask for others to give you respect. It would have been Atlanta. Atlanta was completely destroyed, completely attacked. The Black communities were bombed. People were killed. And it was because they were economically independent. White folks did not like Black people getting above themselves, is how like it would be phrased. And so basically that's what we're going to see. And Du Bois, that's what he basically said. He's like, no, wherever we rise, they beat us back down. We cannot wait for rights. We have to demand them. They're our rights constitutionally. And so this is where you're going to see a turn from people supporting W.E.B. Du Bois to people supporting Booker T. Washington to people supporting W.E.B. Du Bois, okay? And eventually that shift happens. Du Bois is also going to be one of the founding members of the NAACP. So this is when we see the NAACP start to work. One note on the NAACP. So it starts here and it's going to continue and it's still around today. But the NAACP was seen as a more elite group. They focused on pushing for legal rights. So sometimes this seemed inaccessible to poor Black sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Okay. So just kind of keep that in mind that like there isn't like one Black monolithic community. There's a lot of diversity within the Black community. And so we're going to see that like economic status is going to have a big part there. Okay. So anyways, early 1900s now. Okay, so this is when a lot of those Confederate statues are going to be started. Okay, so we're going to see around 1950, I believe, 1915. This is when the KKK is going to reemerge, and we're going to see the White Citizens Council comes around as well, which does the same thing. It's just a different. I believe the White Citizens Council was like more business professionals than like crazy backwoods people. But either way, same objective. So this is when the Daughters of the Confederacy are going to start putting up these statues, or paying, not always, but they start paying for putting up these statues to rewrite the story of the Confederacy. And they want the story to be the good old South. And so go back to the time period during the Civil War, before the Civil War, Frederick Douglass. If you look at pictures of him, he is never smiling in a single picture. And the reason that he did that was intentional, because he never wanted to be portrayed as the happy, like, slave. And so what we're seeing is during this time period, so end of Reconstruction, early 1900s, that time period, they're literally rewriting textbooks to change the, like, causes of the Civil War to states' rights and make it about the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which is states' rights. Okay. Again, states' rights is not technically wrong, but it's the right to own slaves. If you go back and you look, there's a series of different compromises leading up to the Civil War. Every single one of them was about the expansion of slavery. Every single one of them. Okay. Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act, even the Dred Scott case. Like every single bit of this is about the expansion of slavery. There are other things tied in, but that's at the heart of the issue. Okay. So anyways, so there's that. Okay, that was my bit on, I'm not going to get into the statues, but any more about the statues. Okay, let me see where I was at. Okay, Okay, so moving forward, new character, Marcus Garvey. He is a Jamaican man who immigrates to the United States, and he creates what's called the UNIA, and this is when we're going to see kind of this emergence of like pride in Black culture. It existed before, but never on this like huge scale. So go and look into that more. And basically what he says is our ancestors, like he's talking from the perspective of African Americans, he says our ancestors were African kings and queens. At one point in time, the wealthiest rulers in the entire world. So he's referring to Mansa Musa in West Africa. You can go look that up. Like most people believe, yes, most wealthy ruler in the entire world, arguably. Why are we ashamed of our Blackness? And so this idea of Black pride starts to emerge with the UNIA. Kind of that's going on in the North. You can look into that. Okay, so now we're going to get to the start of World War I. With the start of World War I, we're going to see northern cities, industrial cities, start recruiting Black workers from the South. This is the beginning of the Great Migration. Okay, the Great Migration wasn't like this organized movement where the Black community said, hey, let's all leave. No, it was kind of more like a slow trickle. It started in World War I, and it's going to go till 1970s. Okay, time for another book. Okay, this is a big one, but it's really good. Okay, Warmth of Other Suns. And it's That Suns. Okay, that is a fantastic book. It takes 3 different African Americans from different parts of the South, and it traces their journey of leaving the South. One goes to California, one goes to Harlem, and one goes to the Midwest. And it shows, and it's different times because there's different waves of the Great Migration. Fantastic. It's nonfiction, but oh my gosh, it reads like so quickly, and she ties like everything in together. It's amazing. You need to read it. Really good. Okay. During this time period, part of the Great Migration, African Americans from the South are bringing their culture with them, and they're doing things with it in the North. Okay, so it's going to start-ish in Harlem. It's also going on in St. Louis, so we got the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, if you want to look into this, Langston Hughes, fantastic poet and story writer. I Too Sing America, so good. Dream Deferred, very, very good. These are like poems. It just kind of explains what's going on. You also have some music, jazz. This is when jazz is created. And it's just like a mixture of some of this Mississippi blues that's coming and getting kind of mixed up and doing this new thing. Anyways, great, fantastic stuff. Oh, wait, I messed up. I forgot to tell you. Okay, back to Du Bois. Where's that? Can't see. Souls of Black Folks. This is a great, it's very short. If you want an understanding of kind of who he was, not necessarily who he was, but his thought process, read this. Super good. Okay, so Souls of Black Folks by Du Bois. Sorry, I missed that. Okay, so Harlem Renaissance, that's 1920s. Okay, World War II. World War II makes racism ugly. Thanks, Hitler. So Hitler kills a bunch of Jews because of their race, and he's the bad guy. That's the whole story of World War II. The United States treats African Americans as second-class citizens. And so as the Cold War begins, which is the moment World War II ends, it's this huge popularity contest, and America looks bad because they've got a problem with race. And so we're going to see this is part of the reason why the civil rights movement that we think about, like 50s, 60s, that's why it works now. Okay, so there was a civil rights movement, and I forgot. I'm going to have to go back and talk about it. Sorry. There was a civil rights movement in the early 1900s. So what Du Bois was doing, what Booker T. Washington was doing, what Marcus Garvey was doing, and Homer Plessy, we got to talk about him. I got to go back. Sorry. All of that was a civil rights movement. It just didn't work. It just wasn't super effective on a wide scale. So that's why we don't call that the civil rights movement. So anyways, okay, let's go back to Homer Plessy. I'm sorry. So early 1900s, Homer Plessy was a man who looked white but had one black grandfather or grandmother, I can't remember, one black grandparent. And according to the law, it's called the one-drop law. If you have one black ancestor, you're black, and you have to follow those rules. So Homer Plessy, who passes as white, gets on a train car in New Orleans where the law says, like, no, segregated. He gets in the white train car and he sits down. He says, I'm black, I'm black, I'm black. And he did that so that he would get arrested. And the point was so that this case could go to court to show how ridiculous segregation was. And here's the reason. Segregation is based off the idea that whites and blacks need to be separate. This narrative is changing because it's convenient now. During slavery, did whites want blacks separate? Heck no. They wanted their black slaves to do everything for them. Like, I want you to think about the intimacy of slavery. For a white family, who changes your sheets? Who knows when you're intimate with your spouse? Who knows when your period starts? Who is the wet nurse for your child? Who takes care of the elderly people? Who raises the child? Who shaves your neck if you're a slave master? Who puts a blade to your neck and shaves your neck? Who cooks your food? That is not separate, okay? So it's really important to understand that this idea of proximity, separating black and white, that story changes as it's convenient. Black domestics, after slavery is over, black domestics who work in the homes of wealthy whites, they are all up in their business. They know everything about, those black women know everything about that family. They know all of those things. And so this idea of them needing to be separate, it's just about convenience, okay? So anyways, Homer Plessy, it goes to court. Basically, the court case goes against Homer Plessy, and basically it says separate is okay, it's allowed, as long as it is equal. And what we're going to find out is it is absolutely never equal, okay? Black schools were never funded the way that white schools were. Black train cars, never as nice as white train cars. And so this is not going to get overturned until 1954 with Brown versus Board. Okay. Sorry about that. I forgot. Then you got World War I, Great Migration. Then you've got Harlem Renaissance. Then you've got World War II. Okay. Coming out of World War II. Racism is seen as an ugly thing. The United States still has it very badly. But at least on a world scale, it's going to be kind of embarrassing, okay? This is when some black athletes start to emerge. Think Jackie Robinson. The movie 42 that came out, I don't know, 5 years ago or so. Really good. It kind of explains a lot of stuff with that. There's other athletes, but those athletes really do start to break down some walls because of their athletic ability and different things like that. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Okay, so 1954, Brown versus Board. What happens here is we get a couple different court cases. They get together and they challenge this idea of Plessy versus Ferguson, this idea of separate is allowed as long as it is equal. And basically what it did is they compared the resources of black schools, white schools. They looked at a doll test to show how African Americans viewed. I'm not getting into the law test. Really look at the resources. What you need to understand is Brown versus Board did not start out as a way to desegregate public schools. It started out as a way to get black schools funded equally. It turned into black schools are never going to be funded equally unless those black children are sitting beside white children, because white bodies are more valued in our society than black bodies are. Okay, so that kind of ended there. Okay, so 1954, segregation is technically over. The South does not desegregate most of its schools until the 1970s. Hickory City schools did not desegregate until the 1970s. To give you an idea, my mom was a junior in high school whenever their school was desegregated. My dad was in college, okay? So that has not been that long, okay? So whenever people like get in this mindset of like, hey, we need to get over this. This has happened a long time ago, blah, 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 blah. It really wasn't that long ago. Okay. So that's important. Okay. On the heels of that, you've got Emmett Till, lots of other things start happening, Montgomery bus boycott, all of this. We kind of emerge into what we call the civil rights movement, with a capital C, okay? Nonviolence was a choice. It is not natural, okay? People trained themselves in on college campuses, at Black colleges, in meeting halls, to deal with nonviolence. This was a choice. Look up like Bob Moses, nonviolent schools. Again, they did workshops, okay? And so this kind of starts with that. And so we see some progress with the civil rights movement and nonviolence. I'm not going to talk about all the different events because that probably was actually talked about in your school, because that's usually the one thing that's talked about. And so we're going to get the civil rights bill is going to be passed. And then we come up on Selma. Okay. Selma is like kind of confusing. Watch the movie Selma. It's really, really, really good. I'm looking at all the other books I was going to tell you about, but then I forgot. But anyways, watch the movie Selma. Really, really, really good. It'll kind of explain that. Selma is where nonviolence starts to lose traction with the younger folks, okay? So this is where we're going to see the younger folks. So this is like John Lewis's generation. Not John Lewis, but his generation kind of start to become disillusioned with the nonviolence movement. Basically, they say like, hey, it's done some stuff. It has not touched poverty. And it was very difficult. Selma was a success eventually, but it was a long process to get those voting rights, okay? And even after those voting rights, it doesn't really touch poverty. And so you're going to see that's kind of a big turning point that's going to move us more towards the Black Power movement. Okay, another reason why the capital C civil rights movement works is because there's TV. People see these polite Black people in their best church clothes getting beat. They see water hoses or fire hoses being unleashed on them. They see dogs being attacked on them. And that has an impact and is going to desegregate a lot of facilities in the South, a lot of schools, things like that. Okay. Like I said, Black Power movement is going to start to emerge. These ideas are going to come from Malcolm X, but you need to understand Malcolm X dies, I believe, the year after Selma or the year before Selma. He dies very early. And look at Malcolm X's story. He changes his tune at the end of his life before he's assassinated. So just if you think of Malcolm X as this like angry Black man that's like shouting guns, he was at one point, but at the end of his life, he changed his tune, and that was why he was killed. So anyways, but the ideas of Malcolm X are going to be taken by men like Stokely Carmichael, who had worked with King, had been disillusioned with the nonviolence movement, and he starts to form the Black Power movement. And this is where you're going to see the Black Panthers, okay, start to emerge. And if you look at the Black Panthers, the way that they have been represented is not really fair. Okay, they do a lot of things that are positive. They provide health clinics, they provide free breakfast, tutoring programs, and the way that they end is very suspicious. Okay, so anyways, look into that. Also, Angela Davis, very interesting during this time period. You also have to understand that this is a time period of the Vietnam War. And so right after World War II, you've got the Korean War. This is when the military is desegregated. So African-American men are put in combat positions. So by Vietnam, we've got the draft. And what we're going to see is African-American men make up a huge unproportional rate of the frontline deaths put in these combat positions of the soldiers that are being killed. And so a lot of people feel like, hey, we're not good enough to be treated equally, but we're good enough to die in this war in Vietnam, which was questionable to begin with. Okay, so that's going on as well. Okay, I'm going to mention a couple other things super fast. I'm not going to explain them. War on drugs, really war on Black people. Look into it. Shirley Chisholm runs for president. This kind of is not the only thing, but this is something that really illuminates the plight of Black women, that they're up against dealing with racism and sexism. Baki Case, Affirmative Action, Jesse Jackson, Oprah Winfrey, get into the 90s, Rodney King, LA race riots, and then that very closely brings to the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay, so those are all things if you keep following. Okay, a couple things I missed that I forgot to talk about. Okay, if you go back up to the Booker T. Washington time period, Madam C.J. Walker, first Black millionaire, she came out, not really came up with, but she came out with this like new pressing comb that dealt with beauty care cream. There is a mini series on, I believe it's Netflix. I think it's called Madam C.J. Walker. Watch that. That is really, really interesting. She's a super interesting time, like period, like heroine during that time period. Okay, so that's another one. Okay, couple other books that I forgot to mention that I meant to mention. Okay, so if you're talking about like the civil rights movement, capital C, this is like the encyclopedia of it. I'm having a hard time. It's called I've Got the Light of Freedom. It's by Payne. This is like the encyclopedia. So if you want to know, like if you really want to go through particularly what's going on like in the Mississippi freedom struggle, this is going to introduce you to people like Medgar Evers, Ella Baker, basically all of the other people that were doing things besides Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, because they were doing stuff too. Okay, so that's important too. Also during that time period, remembering Jim Crow. So this is a book that has transcribed oral histories, and so this is people talking about their experiences in Jim Crow. It's a lot of different short stories that are really good. Also, kind of during that time, Blood Done Sign My Name, Timothy B. Tyson. This is really great. This is a snapshot of like North Carolina. I can't remember what city it was. Oxford. A story of racial injustice that happens there. And so this is really interesting. This is North Carolina history. If you want to look at the early civil rights movement, like I'm talking the early 1900s, Right to Ride, Blair Kelly, Professor Kelly, she is at NC State. She is phenomenal. Follow her on social media. Interesting, like really, really, really fantastic. But this is her. She talks about this is kind of like the era of Plessy Ferguson. So this is a civil rights movement that almost happened and looked like it was going to happen, but didn't. Okay. All right. If you want to look at Katrina moving forward, like 2006, this shows some racial, like not some, a lot of racial injustice that happens. It's called Overcoming Katrina. This is also a fantastic book that will lead you in that way. And then if you want to go all the way back, like to slavery times, this is called Remembering Slavery. And this was recorded during the Great Depression. And actually some of them come with CDs, so you can actually listen to former slaves like tell their story of slavery. It's really interesting. And it also shows you some other things that I won't get into because holy crap, I've been talking for 50 minutes. Okay. Anyways, this is a semester, like over a semester long course. Like I taught African American history like it was a full year. So this is weeks and weeks of work to talk about. So it's super oversimplified, and I'm really sorry. And I know I forgot a bunch because I don't have any of my notes. Like this is all just random out of my head. So sorry. But anyways, if you have any questions, let me know. Sorry that was so long. All right. Bye. Well, maybe bye.